Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Bob Walker, and I am the leader of the customer solutions team. And joining me today is Adam Close, a solutions architect. And we're going to be talking to you today about better release management with Octopus Deploy. Adam, how are you doing today?
Hello, Bob. Yes, I'm really great. Thank you. Looking forward to this webinar, and I believe it's our first webinar together. So yeah, we're looking forward to that. How are you?
Yeah, I know. I think it's funny. We've both done a number of webinars over the past couple of years, and this is our first one. So let's jump in, and I'm going to start showing our pretty faces. There we go. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. A link of the recording will be emailed to you. Typically, that goes out sometime between 24 to 48 hours afterwards. And if you are joining us on any of our streaming platforms, such as YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch, and you have a question, please ask it in our community Slack in our webinar channel. And if it's your first time joining us, please include an intro. If you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A functionality built into Zoom. It makes it a lot easier for us to keep track of all the questions. Let's talk a little bit about agenda. So we're going to talk first about monoliths and why you'd want to break up a monolith into a project per component. And then we discuss some of the use cases that arise when you do that. We'll include a demo where we'll actually build something from scratch. And then we'll wrap it up with a Q&A. Just to kind of let you know, this demo kind of expects that you have some experience using Octopus Deploy. It is very much not a beginner's demo. So if you get confused, I apologize. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them after this, whenever we can. So, Adam, are you familiar? I'm sure you've set something up like this where you have one big project in Octopus Deploy deploying a bunch of different components.
Yes, pre-Octopus, when I was an Octopus customer, so should I say, I'm looking at your screenshot now, and I can see the number of steps going down to 24. I think I went way past that. And in one project, I was deploying 5 or 6 different components. It all worked. It was great. However, when I only wanted to deploy one of those projects, I had to deploy the rest of the projects, packages in that same deployment process. So a 2-week deployment always took me around 15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah, because it's when you have a big monolith like that, it's great for when you need to deploy that entire stack. But that doesn't happen all the time, especially if you get faster and faster with your releases and you're doing them a lot more frequently. When I was doing releases probably once every quarter, most of the time, yeah, we were deploying the entire stack. But as we got faster and more efficient with our deployments, we were doing probably, we got down to doing a major release probably once every 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and then bug fixes between then. And very rarely do we change every single component. And I imagine you probably ran into the same thing as well.
Yes, definitely. And I suppose it comes out as well when you want to make, let's say, a quick fix. You just want to get, let's say, the web API portion of your application out. You don't want to be deploying the rest of the packages with that. You just want to go with the web API purely for speed.
Yeah, because when you have an emergency and something's broken, you don't want to wait for everything. And even worse, the built-in mechanisms, and I'm sure you probably ran into this as well, is it's like, well, why don't you use channels, or why don't you go in and disable steps? Now, for me, what we did was we, instead of changing the deployment process itself, we would submit like a Word document or an email with like a screenshot saying, all right, these particular steps, uncheck those when you do the deployment. That had some problems.
Yeah, you certainly want to avoid that Word document for any releases. And I'm certainly guilty of unticking the steps during a deployment. And, it works, but there's always that human error. Have I unticked the right step? If I untick this one, is it going to cause some other problems? And it's a headache that you don't really want.
Especially during an emergency.
Yes.
That's the worst thing in the world.
And causing more problems afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah. So it feels like almost independently, a number of our customers kind of arrive at this same conclusion where it's better to break apart your application into like your monolithic project into a project per component. So in this case, I have a database, a scheduling service, web API, and web UI. And I know it was kind of funny. We did that at a previous company that I worked for, and we just kind of all arrived at that same thought. It's like, yes, this makes a lot of sense. And so much so that each project is completely self-contained. So you have the approval steps, any sort of notification, and then the deployment step. And you probably might have, if it's like maybe a database deployment, maybe you're making sure the users are there, or making sure the database is there, or the appropriate schema stuff is there. But the idea is each project is completely self-contained and isolated from one another.
Yes, I just noticed there you have a couple of steps there when you talk about just deploying the database. You
Mhm.
only have you may have an approval for the database, but not for that DBA approval is only needed for that one particular self-contained project as well, and not for the whole deployment process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you have a big monolith, it's like, what steps can we disable? And by default, manual interventions you can't disable. So you almost have to get additional sign-offs. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
But then you run into this really fun question of, how do I easily deploy from test to staging? And you finish up your QA cycle, and happy days, and everything works out great. And in the past, we had two steps. We had the chain deployment step, and we had the deploy release step. And they weren't really designed for that particular use case. I want to deploy the latest stuff from test to staging. Because I'm Adam, I'm going to put you on a spot. Let's say we have a configuration like this. What release would be picked when I want to deploy from test to staging for the web UI? Because what we want is the 221 1.0.12. But how do those steps pick the latest release?
Yeah, and I'm so glad I know this, because I've actually been caught out by this in the past. I believe, and obviously you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it's always going to pick the highest release or the highest package in that release.
Yes, it's for that specific channel. So it's the most recent release created for that channel. And so in this case, when we have a use case like this, the 1.0.14 will be the one that those steps try to deploy to test, and then to staging, and try to deploy from dev to staging if we told it to do something like that. And that makes things very unpredictable as to what's going to happen. We also run into this where you have, say, your database project and a web API project. You have the exact same versions, across dev, test, staging, and prod. But you have the scheduling service and the web API. You had an emergency bug fix go out, and you need to push that up there. How do you skip those existing releases? How can you easily do that without having to go in and uncheck it, or disable steps or anything along those lines? And this is an interesting one, and I think both of us have probably run into this quite often. How do you restrict version numbers? So in this case, I have 2021.1.1. That's something that, say, the development team is starting to work on, but we're in the process of we're trying to deploy 2021 1.0 to staging in production.
Yeah, and I've definitely been in that situation myself, and it's perfectly normal for those kind of major releases to be in development, where development team kind of testing out a feature branch or the next major release, they kind of throw that up in there into development. In the past, I've done a lot of messing around with channels and those versioning rules and that kind of thing, and that's kind of how I've got around it. But it's always been kind of complicated to get that particular portion right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really what you want to do is that restriction. You just say, I really only want to deploy 2021 1.0, whatever the latest release is for that. Because I know this for a fact. I very rarely did I get something to staging on the first build when I'm doing kind of a major release, or maybe a minor bug fix, or I would say not a minor bug fix, but maybe a patch or something like that. It seems like it always takes 2 or 3, as we see in this screenshot.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's always a few failures first.
Yeah, or something just doesn't look quite right. Now, if you're using some of those steps, so like the deploy release step, this is something that came up quite often. which is how do I approve a release and how do I approve it only once while at the same time having those approvals and those child projects for when you need to do an emergency deployment, when you need to just deploy that one bit. Uh, how do you do something like that? And I think we had an earlier conversation about this where really like an approval, you're not really approving a build, so to speak. You're approving the release number. So 2021 1.0, not 2021 1.0.256 or something along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. So if I go back to our previous company again, we had release managers, and all they cared about was the release. They didn't know the specifics of the child projects or components they were going out. They looked at a set of changes and release notes and said, "Yeah, they're good to go."
Yep.
And not the individual projects themselves.
It's funny you mentioned release notes because how do you view the release notes in this situation? Do you have to click into each individual project and find the latest release? And like, I hope I'm picking the right release notes.
Yeah, I've seen that where we've had to go into each child project as well, just to get the releases for that particular package.
And then finally, how can you approve something at 11 a.m.? Because I imagine, when you were working with those release managers, they probably didn't want to be online for a 7 p.m. deployment. Maybe they'd be okay with that, but probably less inclined to be online for a midnight deployment or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think probably the main point there is they didn't need to be either.
Yeah.
They'd already approved the release. They'd already spoke to the customers to let them know this release was going out. They didn't actually need to be on at 12 a.m. And it's also the extra barrier when you're doing your production deployment. You kind of want to remove any barriers when you're doing that deployment as much as you can. So if you're doing a deployment, let's say 11 p.m. at night, you don't want to not be able to get in contact with an approver. If you fail to make contact, then you can't go ahead and do the deployment. That's the production deployment then gone out of the window.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. And so let's see if we can solve this. So I feel I'm going to feel like kind of like one of those salespeople that you see on those infomercials that you probably are broadcasting right now. Which, what if I were to tell you, Adam, that there is a step template out there that would solve all of those problems for you?
I'm sold already.
There you go. Okay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to create a release orchestration project using a brand new step template that I created called Deploy Child Octopus Deploy Project. I like to be very wordy. And we will try to solve all of those various use cases within this demo. So there's going to be kind of a lot to take in. I'll do my best to kind of build on top of each individual use case to hopefully make a lot of sense. A couple of things I will point out with it being a step template. You don't have to run the absolute latest version of Octopus Deploy. It was actually developed on an instance using 2020, I think 3. But any 2020 release should work. I think actually any 2019 release should work as well. As you can see, I'm actually only running 2020.5. I'm not running the absolute latest and greatest here. A couple other things just to make things go a little bit quicker. I have already pre-configured variables. So we're going to be talking about these different variables. I'll come back to this screen a couple of times, but just know that those variables already exist. We don't have to recreate those. It'll just take time that we just don't have. Okay. So our goal for our first use case is we want to move everything from test to staging. So the .9, .3, .28, and .12. So let's go ahead and let's create our deployment process. As you can see, I don't have anything defined. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add the step. And thankfully, I already have it installed. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to deploy the database. And we'll close that will run on the Octopus server. Now, this particular step template, because it is a step template, it uses the API quite extensively. And because of that, we have to provide an API key. One thing you will notice with this particular step is that there are a lot of different options. One of my goals with this was, as I was writing a particular feature inside of the step template, I always thought, oh, that's an interesting feature, but what if someone doesn't want it? Or what if someone would prefer something else? But in reality, all you really need to do is provide these three parameters, and the step template will take care of the rest. Everything else is optional. So it's just the child project name and the API key. Now, one thing we do want to make sure we cover is that whole concept of basically filtering on a particular release number. And so within this, one of the options that you can provide is a wildcard. So in my case, we're going to be providing that variable, which is the release pattern. So we come back to the variable screen, we'll see it's 221 1.0.star. Now that dot star is important because if I didn't have that and I did something like 221 1.1 star, it would pick up 11, 12, 13, and 14. But by having that period and then that star, it knows, oh, all I'm doing is just the build numbers. So I've added that for this particular step as well. But everything else we can leave as is. And this is just strictly optional for that one particular use case where we want to restrict the version numbers. You don't have to do that. And you can provide, like I said, a wildcard or a specific version. All right. So we have the database up there. And because I'm lazy, I'm going to go ahead and clone this for each of the other projects. Now, you might be asking, why can't I go in and just provide, say, a comma separated list? And I did think about that. And what would happen is there's the ability to provide prompted variables. There's ability to choose a specific channel. There's a lot of different things like tenants and multi-tenancy that comes into play. And what would happen is this really crazy matrices that you'd have to kind of figure out. So the way it works is each component has a step. So scheduling service. Now, one of the nice things about this is we can now configure this scheduling service because maybe it doesn't have any dependencies on the web API. We can configure this to run at the same time. So I'm going to run in parallel with the previous step. And then I'm going to deploy the web API. And make sure I update the web API. All right. I'm sorry, web UI. Almost made that mistake. That's a downside of doing something live. Sometimes you forget how to type. So let's go ahead and save this. And let's take a quick step back and look at what this process looks like right now. So we're going to deploy the database. If that database is successful, then we'll move on. If it fails, then we'll stop the deployment completely. And all the database components will have to be deployed successfully. The web API and the scheduling service, they are not dependent on one another. So we will go ahead and deploy those at the exact same time. And then finally, we're going to deploy the web UI. So let's go ahead and create a release. 0. And let's go ahead and push this up to staging. Now, fingers crossed, I configured everything correctly the first time. All of our run-throughs I did it the first time, but we shall see. So it's doing a couple of things. It's telling you what versions it found. It also is waiting for that deployment to finish up. And by default, that is the default behavior. You can also click on the link of the deployment when it's doing it. So as you can see, this is exactly what it did. And it also will let you know if it finished with a status of success or failure or anything along those lines. Waiting is strictly optional. You don't have to wait. But by default, it will wait, and there's a timeout. So it will wait for 30 minutes. So if you have a deployment that takes longer than 30 minutes, then it will actually cancel it. But again, all of that stuff is configurable within the step template at the dozen or so parameters. So yeah, we have deployed everything to staging, the exact version, and we didn't try to deploy 2021 1.0 or 2021 1.014. It just picked the latest version that was in test and push it up to staging. All right. So Adam, we've covered the simple case. Let's talk about approvals for a little bit. So I'm sure we really want to deal with that. I only want to approve once. So what we're going to do is this step template has the ability. So first we're going to clone it. And let's say get database release. Well, one of the parameters inside of here is what's known as, it allows you to do what if. So what this means is it will do everything up until the point of creating, actually deploying the release. So we'll figure out what release to promote. And then also when you set this to yes, it will also set an output variable called release to promote. So if you want to show that in a manual intervention instruction, which we're going to do, you can absolutely do that. In addition, you can also save the release notes as artifacts because it grabs the release. So showing those release notes or saving those release notes as an artifact isn't much of a stretch at that particular point in time. And so what this will allow you to do is you can actually come in and you can view those release notes after the fact or during the deployment or anything like that. So make sure that we have everything looking good on this. And finally, we'll only want to run this for production because it only makes sense to do something like this in production. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and save this right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reorder this to appear before the deploy. I'm going to use my good friend clone. And we'll clone 3 more times. So let's say get web API release. And we'll just change it to web API. And get scheduling service release. It has to be called get something release. That's just for my pre-configured variables for everything to work just right for the instructions. And you'll see what if I don't provide this, it will look a little goofy, but it'll make sense. It'll make sense in just a second. Web UI. Just want to make sure I change the scheduling service real quick. I didn't. I knew I was forgetting something. One other thing before I forget is just like before, because we're actually not doing any deployments, we can tell this to run in parallel as well. So we can tell the web UI release. Let's go ahead and collapse these. To run in parallel with that previous step. And let's tell the web API to do the same thing. All right. So we have the get. So we're doing the what if stuff. We have the deploy. Now we just need manual interventions. So let's go ahead and add those really quick. Other. And we're going to say QA approve. And we have our instructions already pre-populated with a variable. And it's a please approve release. And it's just grabbing a whole bunch of information from the previous step on something like this. Do QA. And we only want to run this for specific environments. So we'll just do it for production. And we should be good with this. I'm going to use my good friend clone again. Now, typically, you're probably not going to be going through this many changes all at once. Hopefully, it's once you kind of set it, it's one of those cases where you can kind of forget it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of this, isn't it, Bob? That once you create this release orchestration, it's very rarely going to change, and it's normally the component, the child projects that will change more frequently than the release orchestration.
Yeah, that's a really good. Yeah, that's a perfect point. I would, once you kind of have this set up, I would foresee this changing once in a blue moon, maybe when you added a new component or something like that. And one thing you'll notice is I've been setting these to run business owners is parallel. So let's go ahead and then finally what I'm going to do is I'm going to reorder this one more time. And we'll take a big step back and we'll look at what this deployment process looks like before we push it up. So let's go ahead and do done, and let's save it. So what it's doing is we're getting the release information, then we're going to do the approval, and then we're going to do the deployment. We only get that information in production, and we only do the approvals in production, obviously. So let's go ahead and let's create the release, and 0.rc1. So assuming I set up everything correctly, first thing that's going to happen is it's going to deploy to staging. One of the default behaviors of this particular step template is it sees if that release has already been deployed to staging and is the current release deployed to staging. I think that's really important to kind of pick out, is that if 2021 1.0.9 is the current release in staging, it's going to go ahead and skip that. If it's not, then it will deploy it for you. But as you see, it skipped all of it because we've already deployed all the other component projects, which is perfect. So it just moved on and it went pretty quickly. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and deploy to production. Now let's hope I got everything configured just right. So as you can see, it generated the artifacts. And what the artifacts look like, and I'll show you, is it's pretty much this. This is what's inside of here, is these artifacts. So one of the output variables is the version that it's going to be promoted. And if you're using the build information within Octopus Deploy, which is what you're seeing right now, it's going to tell you what package versions are going out, what work items it found, if it found any, as well as what commits it found as well. You'll notice it's the exact same except for the package version. That's just because I was lazy and I just reused the same build information for all of it. But if you weren't using the build information, that's perfectly fine as well. If you have any release notes attached to that particular release, it will show those instead of this build information stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed for each one. Now, typically, you wouldn't have one person be the QA, the BA, and the DBA, but for the purposes of this particular demo, I am. So what's going to happen is, how this works is when this step template detects that a manual intervention is happening in the child project, it will look at the parent project and it's going to say, I've come across a manual intervention for QA. Did we have anyone in the parent project approve that release? We did. What team is this person a member of? Oh, they're a member of the QA team. Okay, they can proceed. If it didn't find anyone with the QA team, it would actually just pause it and wait, and it would send you out all these different notifications saying, hey, I got a manual interventions. You have to approve them, or this is going to, if you wait 30 minutes, it will get canceled. But what it looks like is, this is one of the downsides of the API. I've used an API to manage a lot of this stuff, is it has to run in the context of that. It has to run under the context of the person attached to the API key. So what I did is I created a custom service account called Release Manager, attached it to the appropriate teams. So in this case, DBA and QA, so it can approve and take ownership of that manual intervention. But when it does this, what it's saying is that I auto-approve the deployment. It's because this parent project, Octopet Shop Release Orchestration, for this release to this environment with this server task ID, was approved by this user. And it says that the reason I did that is because it's the member of one of the teams. In addition, it includes a link back to that task. So if we were to copy this and paste it in, we would see who did the actual approvals, and we'd see, yep, this, Bob was the one who took ownership of QA approve. He was the one who submitted approve. everything along those lines. So go ahead and close this.
I think one of the great things about this step template that you built as well, all the logic for the approvals is in the release orchestration. You don't actually have to change any of the child projects.
Yes.
If anybody's out there with a similar setup that are using an existing deploy release step and you want to move over to this new step template, you don't have to change any of your child projects over. All the logic is taken care of in the parent project.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I prefer this approach is that I don't have to send in different variables, like any sort of like prompted variables or overwrite variables, or set up run conditions in my child projects to skip those approvals and everything like that. Okay. Well, we've done the approvals and it's deployed to production. So that's a good thing. But the release manager still had to be online for that deployment to production, even though we have this release orchestration project. So let's solve one of the bigger use cases, which is how can I approve something at 11 a.m. for a 7 p.m. deployment, or how can I approve something on a Tuesday for a Thursday night deployment? So what I'm going to do is I've already have this set up, and I have a different lifecycle with a new environment called prod approval. So I'm going to change that. And what I want to do is I want to hop back over to the dashboard really quick. You'll notice that none of the child projects have this prod approval step. Only our release management projects. They're the only ones that have that prod approval step. And that's very intentional because really it's just about gathering approvals for that production deployment. So we have to do a couple of changes into our deployment process for this to work. Obviously, we want these steps to run on the prod approval step, the prod approval environment, not the production environment. But we have to do a couple of other things. So first off, we have to change what is the destination environment name, because how this works is it's using the default, which is the Octopus environment name. So when I'm deploying to production, it goes, yes, you want to promote to production. Great, awesome. But in the prod approval step, when we're getting this information, we're not deploying to prod approval. We're actually trying to get the information from a deployment from staging to production. So there's a variable that we have set up for this called deployment environment name. So let's come back to our all variable screen really quick. And let's take a look at that. So the deployment environment name is by default the Octopus environment name for every environment but prod approval. When I'm in prod approval, my destination environment is production. So that covers that. The other thing that we'll need to change is just what environment we're going to run in. So let's change this quickly to run in prod approval. And so we're going to repeat that step we're going to repeat that for the next few steps really quick. Deployment. And hopefully you wouldn't have to go through this whole rigmarole, because hopefully you set this up right from the start. I just realized I didn't change that environment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a concept I've not thought about, using the environment just for approvals. It's the first time I've seen this, and it works. It looks like it's going to work really well.
I think when you're using probably the step template, I think it works pretty well. I've seen other cases where we've tried to do it and you end up in a situation where you have in the child projects, if you have this environment, then you kind of have everything going one way when you're doing your deployments, except in that one environment. And that doesn't make a lot of sense in the child project because you're trying to deploy your code, but it makes a lot of sense when you are in a release orchestration project because you're just trying to move some bits around. QA approve. As a smart person, I'd be able to talk and use my mouse at the same time, but I'm not.
You're doing a better job than what I can do, Bob. So don't worry too much. Doing great.
Let's save this. Okay, so everything's running in prod approval, but now we need to tell the deployment steps that they need to pull the approvals, not from the current environment, but from the approval environment. And so we have another variable set up for this called the approval environment name. And in this case, it's fairly simple. It is prod approval, just to make it super easy. So let's go ahead. The nice thing is we don't have to change what environments. Oh, we do have to change what environments they ran in. I almost forgot. We don't want to run this in the prod approval environment. So let's skip. I think we made that mistake on one of the run throughs. And I'm like, why is this trying to deploy in the middle of prod approval? And it just breaks. I'm like, whoops.
Yeah, I remember that. We always learn something from the failure. So
exactly. Skip. Now, one thing I should point out is that if you don't want to use this auto approval stuff and you just want to use this for deploying your child projects, that's all. Again, the whole idea behind this is to make it as customizable as possible. So if you want to, you can turn this off by changing this from yes to no.
Yeah, and it still has, if you don't want to take advantage of the auto approvals, the step template still has benefits of taking those deployments that are in staging just to go to production, rather than some of the issues that we highlighted with the deploy release step, where it takes the highest release in that deployment.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I really like about this, and I'm actually going to show you, because we have a little bit of time to do this, is we're going to redeploy. Basically, we're going to try to redeploy exactly everything. But let's go ahead and skip. We'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So let's go ahead and save this. All right. So let's take a look at our process really quick. We're getting everything in prod approval. And then when we're doing our deploys, we are skipping. So hopefully everything is set up correctly. One of the things that we have to do is, because the default behavior is don't deploy if it's already been deployed to that destination environment, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a brand new release really quick. And thankfully I should have all the release stuff all configured to automatically deploy to dev and test. Because if we don't do this, basically when we do our demo, when I do the next demo, it's just going to skip over everything. And it's just going to say, hey, everything's already up in production. It's going to kind of defeat the whole purpose of this. So this should be, I think it should be on 10 pretty quickly. There it goes. And that's one thing I should point out with this particular step template is it only picks the last successful release to go to staging, and it has to be completed. So if you have a deployment that's in process, when you run this step template, it won't pick that up. If it fails or canceled, it won't pick that up either. It has to be the last successful release in the previous environment to go to stage, in this case, from test to staging. All right, so let's create another release because we made a whole bunch of changes. RC2. And all we're going to do for this particular demo is just deploy the database. But you're going to see it just, it picks that up and it's going to deploy the web API and then the scheduling service. It's not going to do anything for the web API or the scheduling service. There it goes. Awesome. Let's go ahead and deploy to the prod approval environment. It's gathering all the information. Good, and didn't try to redeploy. That had happened. One of the things I should point out is that if it doesn't find a release, it's going to tell you. It's going to say, hey, this release is already deployed to the destination environment, and you're not going to see any artifacts, any release notes for that, because there's no reason to pull it in. That's why we only have the database as the artifact. Let's go ahead and let's proceed. And that should be it. So we've gone through the prod approval environment. I should pick it up in just a second. So now what we can do is, if we wanted to, when we're ready to go to production, we already have all our approvals. They're all ready to go. So if we wanted to, we can come in here and we could schedule this to start on, say, maybe we want to do Thursday night. So hit OK, and we want to do 8:30 p.m. We could go ahead and do that because all the approvals have already been gathered, and we can just kick this off, schedule it, and then we could also maybe add in some sort of notification. So if anything goes wrong, to page someone, or to send out an email if everything goes right, any number of those different things. But we're not going to do that right now just because it's a demo, it's a webinar. I'm sure everyone doesn't want to wait for a day and a half for that to finish up.
And if the approvals have already been taken and you do the production deployment and you notice an issue with that release, you could potentially fix that issue up. Let's say you're doing this at 11 p.m., fix that issue up and deploy that release out again without having to get the approvals again. Because essentially, again, the release has been approved. If you've noticed a small issue that you can get fixed, the approvals have already been sanctioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can just show what that looks like really quick. Because again, the way that this works is it's not snapshotting it's not snapshotting these release numbers. That's one of the reasons why I think you want to have a release filter. But let's go back and let's talk about that. But as you can see, before we do that, we have the interruptions. It picked it, and what we're going to see in this case is it picked the prod approval environment. And so you can see, yep, this was the environment it went to. And again, we can copy this, and it will take us back to that prod approval and all that other good stuff that went along for the ride. But yeah, let's talk about that use case that you just brought up, because I think it's an interesting one. So let's say that the 1.0, let's say that failed when we went to production, and we found out what the issue is, and we have something ready to go. So 1.11. We're going to go ahead and we're going to push it up to dev, and then we're going to wait for it to go to test really quick. So it shouldn't take too long. Let's wait. And it already went up to so like, okay, let's get this up to staging. Okay, so now we're ready to go to production. Well, we've already got those approvals. And what we can do is, what would happen is this release would have failed because it detected a failure. And so what we can do is we could just say retry. In this case, we're just going to redeploy. And it's going to pick that release. It's going to go up. 20.11 is already up there. Or the 1.0.11 is already, it needs to be deployed. I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. Again, this is one of the reasons why I recommend having a release pattern as opposed to just taking whatever the latest is, because you could easily abuse this in the wrong way. But if you have a release pattern on this and say only grab 2021 1.0.star, that's what's been approved for some cases. But yeah.
Yeah, I've certainly been in a scenario where I am doing a late night deployment and it's failed, and there's been no chance of getting an approval again. So it's kind of pushed that production deployment back potentially a week. I've certainly been there a couple of times. So this has definitely saved me back then.
And we didn't have to change anything in our deployment process for that. I think that's a big thing to kind of point out, is that we didn't change anything. We didn't alter anything. We just reused the pre-existing approval for 2021.1.0. Awesome. So those were all of the big use cases for this step template. I would be remiss in not pointing out we didn't cover all of the different variables and options inside of this particular step template. I have written a couple of blog posts on this, and we'll include those blog posts as part of the follow-up email. We'll actually walk you through exactly what you just saw on the screen today, but in written form. And that's the first blog post. The second blog post is a interesting one where it talks about tenants, because once you add in tenancy, it gets a little wild with something like that. So we didn't, that was way out of scope for this particular webinar, but this step template is tenant aware. and it uses the tenant that's being deployed. So if the parent project's deploying for, say, like the internal tenant, then it will use that in the child projects as well. So, but yes, there are a lot of other options that I didn't cover on something like this. So yes, please read through that the blog post. It kind of goes into a lot more detail as to what those different options are. Awesome.
Cool.
Leanne, speaking from the great UK, are there any questions?
There are indeed.
Perfect.
So we've got one from Ricardo, which says, with the deploy child Octopus deploy project step, you
Yes.
can only deploy already existing releases for child projects. Is it
Correct.
possible to create releases as well in the release orchestration project?
No, it's not. The big reason behind that is because when I wrote this, the anticipated use case behind it is that the build server would be the one that would create the release and say deploy it to dev.
Cool. And we have another one from Chris on Slack. He did ask 2 questions, but you actually answered the first one already. So the second
Perfect.
question was, how do you account for breaking changes in the database deploy if the UI and API are still up and running? And the same with breaking API changes when the UI is still up.
That's a really good question. So if the UI, okay. So in that particular case, if you're going to have breaking changes like that, I would probably suspect the release orchestration project, you might want to have maybe a run book that you call, or maybe another project that basically sets some sort of offline status that stops your application, or something along those lines. You can force redeploy deployments. So you could like, hey, this is my deployment to stop everything. But I might do a run book for something like that. So what would happen? I think it's easier to explain. I think it's easier to show. So at the start of my deploy step here, in between 7 and 8, I might call a run book that basically stops those applications, or take something offline, or put the offline notice or something along those lines, where you could have those kinds of things. Right. And then obviously step 12 would bring everything back online.
Cool. Yeah. Interesting one.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case. I'm gonna have a think about that a little bit more, because that's a very interesting use case, and I imagine it's gonna come up a few more times. But yeah.
Yeah. And one more from Mike.
Okay.
We have a weekly release cadence with different components each time. If your components are more dynamic for each release, is there a better way to handle this than modifying or creating a new parent orchestration project each time?
So with that one, yeah, that's a good question. It depends. My first question that I would probably ask was how many projects in general, or how many different components are going to be changing. What I might recommend is having different release orchestration projects per like application and just pushing those out. Or you could have one massive release orchestration project if you wanted to do that. And again, the way that this step works is that it only goes, it will not deploy any projects if it's already been promoted. So if you weren't changing if I only changed, as we saw, if I only changed the database, it would just deploy the database. But yeah, that's an interesting question of if you have a list that's changing all the time. I would probably have a one to n static projects for your different applications and just push out those static projects.
Yeah, and I guess it's also worth thinking about would they even fit together in the first place? Why are they that dynamic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question on something like that, because I think there's a lot of questions that get raised when I get asked that naturally. So it's a good question. I think it is something that a lot of customers run into. So I'll probably have another think on that. And if we come up with a really good solution, there's probably another opportunity for a few more blog posts based on the step template.
Definitely. Well, I think that rounds up the questions.
Okay, perfect. There we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We'll give you a few minutes of your day back. Just a quick reminder, again, a recording of the webinar will be emailed to you. In addition to that, any sort of, we'll include links to blog posts and everything like that. We also have an upcoming webinar on deploying to a rancher managed Kubernetes cluster with Octopus Deploy. That's coming up in 2 weeks. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Leanne, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Bob. Enjoyed that.